All attendees that are taking the time to checking in with us on this webinar organized by the Chamber of Commerce, who granted us the possibility to share some of our experiences on this particular topic. Jeroen and myself, we would like to take you on a little bit of a journey that will probably take a bit less than 60 minutes. So we will stay in the 1 hour slot in total on this webinar named How to Successfully Survive a Recession. What we will do in this webinar, touch upon multiple subjects that are probably applicable to entrepreneurs cross-industry, but are pretty much recognizable since we are entrepreneurs in the region, Dutch Caribbean, or more specifically, entrepreneurs or part of companies that are operating in Curacao. And of course, we're going through one of the, I would say, for our generation, one of the biggest crises we've seen across industry, and especially for our own little island / country. What we chose for a subtitle is Leadership, Growing Yourself and Your Company into a Prosperous Future. No typo there. It's a combination of leadership and lean, and why we've chosen to combine those two terms and concepts is something we will touch upon later on in the presentation. Before we dig into details, it might be valuable to provide a little bit of background about ourselves, so you know who is talking and with what kind of background we're talking. Jeroen, would you kick off with something about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Roy. Well, my name is Jeroen Boks, and I moved from the Netherlands to Curacao in the beginning of June of this year. So I'm freshly arrived. Before I moved to Curacao, I lived in The Hague in the Netherlands, and I worked for almost 4 years as a tax lawyer for KPMG in the Netherlands. My expertise in the Netherlands was national and international tax advice for family-owned businesses and wealthy individuals. And today I will try to provide input on Roy's points from a tax perspective.
Yeah, because the only thing I know from tax that I submit taxes myself, and that's as far as my knowledge on tax goes. But of course, within a company like ours, because we're both employed by Grant Thornton, one of the accounting firms in the region, especially in the context of what we're talking about today, let's say the capabilities that in the service line of which Jeroen is part of, tax services, and especially also combined with the service line I'm in advisory, is really a useful and almost a necessary combination. Something about myself, I moved to Curacao in 2016 in April. Long ago, got acquainted with Curacao through my military background. I'm a former Navy officer. So back in the day, long time ago, I signed an employment contract for 12 years and came here as a young naval officer to Curacao in 2002. Spent 6 months on Pereira. Then I think the love for the island was born, and luckily for me, almost 5 years later, I met my current wife. She's from Curacao, and she went to the Netherlands for studying and doing her initial work experience. And in 2016, we migrated to Curacao with our family, and we have been, and we're planning to stay for the rest of our lives. From a content perspective, I've done multiple things that will be touched upon in the presentation as well. Of course, a military background, but mostly behind the desk, I must admit. But it comes with a certain awareness on how to manage an organization through crisis. A lot of my friends have been to let's say countries or regions where actual wars are being fought and a real crisis is at hand. So a lot of training and concepts have been taught to us there. In addition to that, in my career, I spent most of my time on risk management, cybersecurity, business continuity management, and especially the latter comes in particularly in this phase we're in right now on the island. So business resilience, talking about contingency plans and scenario plannings connected to your strategy is something I've done already in, let's say, in governmental context, and afterwards in private sector as well. and within Grant Thornton, I'm responsible for the advisory service line. And we touch upon a comprehensive set of services ranging from leadership development courses to real business continuity, tabletop exercises, and everything in between. So a wide range of advisory services. So that's pretty much us. Both living on Curacao as a citizen and as a professional, and part of a company that's going through a crisis as well. So we'll be sharing some of our own experiences in the next 45 minutes too. But before we go into that, what we would like to do is take all the attendees into a little bit of a Q&A or a statement baseline. So if it would be possible for you all to answer the statement that will appear on our screens probably within seconds, that would be really helpful. And the statement is, I was prepared for an economic between Mark's crisis before the current COVID-19 pandemic. So and that's a simple true or false. And maybe, Jeroen, if you see something on your screen before I do, just about results.
I see that 23 people have voted. 20 people voted for false and 3 people for true. So 87% of all the attendees voted for false.
Very good. That's not really good because I'm not sure what you voted, Jeroen, but I'm not allowed to vote as a host. I would say false. I would say false as well.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this might be the reason why it's a good thing that we have a chat for the next 40 minutes on this particular topic. I don't think a lot of companies had a pandemic in their business continuity or disaster recovery planning. And probably from now on forward, everybody has a pandemic top of mind. We will talk about the impact and the results of such an event later on as well. Since this is all about us as an entrepreneur or us as an employee of a company dealing with recession, dealing with crisis, and that's of course something really personal in the sense that we take it in. And probably one by one, we respond in a very different fashion. So what we would like to do as part of this small journey we're on for the next 40 minutes, start off with a little bit of, I would say a framing clip we have out of The Matrix. And this is, of course, as you all know, Neo. So without elaborating a bit about this scene, let's have a look.
I was looking for an answer. It's the question that drives us, Neo. It's the question that brought you here. You know the question, just as I did.
What is the Matrix?
The answer is out there, Neo. It's looking for you. And it will find you if you want it to.
You have a problem with authority, Mr. Anderson. You believe that you are special, that somehow the rules do not apply to you. Obviously, you are mistaken. This company is one of the top software companies in the world because every single employee understands that they are part of a whole. Thus, if an employee has a problem, the company has a problem. The time has come to make a choice, Mr. Anderson. Either you choose to be at your desk on time from this day forth, or you choose to find yourself another job. Do I make myself clear?
Yes, Mr. Reinhardt, perfectly clear. Thomas Anderson?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay. Great. Have a nice day.
Yeah, so this was Neo, of course, probably seen by many of you currently attending the webinar. And the message we have with this particular clip is that once going into recession or a crisis, there are multiple ways to respond to it. As you've probably also heard about the concept of freeze, fight, or flight. Typically, when a deer looks into the headlights of a car, and typically most of the time freezes, at least in Hollywood movies. This is the same for us as an entrepreneur, as a professional, and really being struck by a crisis, by a recession, by something that's really hampering or impacting your business. This is what happens in a sense. How are we dealing with the fact that we are confronted with such downfalls in a sense? So the call to adventure is here for us to grab the issue at hand and go forward instead of doing nothing and just being sad about the fact that you're being confronted with a crisis or a recession. So in terms of discussing some of the tools and tips and tips we have for an organization to deal with a recession, and very specifically zooming in to what we're currently encountering on the COVID-19 pandemic. But this, of course, is also applicable to other situations you're in as an entrepreneur when you're dealing with clients, client groups that are falling away for a certain reason, products that are no longer selling anymore because competition is getting fierce. The resilience wheel is something that was further developed at the beginning of this year. It's a concept that came out of the financial restructuring businesses within GT, combined with the people that are working in business continuity and disaster recovery. So the resilience wheel is all about which topics to address as an entrepreneur that will help you take the crisis on head on, so to speak. So if we look into the 5 topics that are part of this resilience wheel, from top to bottom, we'll be discussing cash management, contingency planning, stakeholder management, crisis management, and strategy and leadership. So to start off with the first, must be said, I'm not an accountant, but I'm part of the leadership team of GT. And cash management, as they say, cash is king, but especially in a crisis and in this context, the pandemic, that's truly the case. So what we've developed is a visual tool that could help entrepreneurs in addressing the questions, the pressing issues that they should be dealing with to go through the crisis from a cash management perspective. We will probably be sharing some of the collateral in which this resilience wheel is further elaborated on. But let me give you a little bit of a glimpse what the model is all about. If we read the wheel from inside out, the short-term cash flow forecast is the most critical to have a real good grip on. So a 13-week, more or less, 4-month forecast in which you have a really clear view when cash needs to go out, cash is coming in, and what kind of influences are that could probably impact that forecast. What we've seen in the last 6 months, organizations on Curacao, but also on the other islands of the Dutch Caribbean and globally, is that the organizations that prior going into a crisis or a pandemic that had a real good control on cash flow forecasting and cash flow analysis are the ones that are best suited to find out where in a crisis like this one that's lingering, when issues are, let's say, to be presented to the company, and of course, not being discussing the companies. For example, now in hospitality, there was no need for them to be aware of that, because the business was gone from the very day that the air bridge were closed. So that's a totally different situation. But if you see things a little bit coming, that's for sure something you should work with. Some of the questions from inside out that are relevant for topics to address that impact short-term cash flow to further to the outside rings of this wheel are important to address, and they touch upon, you know, the real financial function of your company, but also the other underlying concepts in your operating model and your business strategy. Let me just take one from each ring. What are the ones, if we go clockwise, and then in the inner dark gray circle, what are the critical vulnerabilities in your business? If there is a supply or distribution chain interruption, what steps can be taken to mitigate these? For example, what we've seen on Curacao, a lot of retailers and also the supermarkets were very anxious about COVID-19 coming into place, airlift being blocked. What does it mean, for example, for goods coming in? What does it mean for my supply chain? We're an island, all our supply chains are going off Curacao, and everything what's coming in, products for the business, but also to be sold to the community of Curacao, have a real strong reliance on supply chain. So a lot of entrepreneurs were dealing with that. Different sectors, different challenges, but for sure something to look into now during crisis, but also prior, and that's something we will discuss in another part of the week. If we take another one, if we go to the one below, let's say in between 4 and 6 o'clock, how will your operating model need to change if your available workforce is suddenly reduced? Let's look into the example that, for example, now in Curacao, we had 𝘀𝘂𝗰𝗲𝗀𝗃𝗍𝗃, and we had working from home. And for a lot of companies, especially in the region where digital transformation tried to make its way into the region, but never really did, except some of the companies, of course. COVID-19 was like the most successful project manager to bring digital transformation into the marketplace, because business had to continue. Employees were at home, but there was no infrastructure there to work from. So there was a lot of dynamics there that we were, let's say, almost not willingly, but forced into, but something to address. If we take one or two from the light gray area, and then one to the left, let's say 9 p.m.-ish, do you have early warning dashboards that provide you with data? What processes need to change to be able to immediately respond to changes in expectations? So typically this would, for example, mean if you see things coming in dips on your funnel from a sales funnel perspective, or you're seeing certain product market combinations going worse and worse from a revenue forecast perspective, then it's really eminent to have such forecasting dashboards in place so you can act on them. So this is the first part of the wheel. Cash management, cash is king, really important, and having that in tight control gives you a good clue and insights where to go with your business. So contingency planning, the second one. Something in the region that is something, for example, financial service companies are obliged to do, let's say, directed from, for example, central bank. They need to work on disaster recovery scenarios, and they need to work on business continuity as well. What's important there is that for most of the companies that we are working with, these are really paper exercises and never really went through in a live situation exercise. So what's important for scenario planning in terms of contingencies, it's important to really go through those plans and see what would happen in terms of scenarios really manifesting themselves. This particular one we have in our hand now, so the pandemic, is a really extreme one. I think I haven't seen any company in the Dutch Caribbean region that had a clear-cut plan for a pandemic response, but there are of course many other responses to plan for, like hurricane responses, specifically I would say for St. Martin and the upper islands of the Dutch Caribbean. But you could, for example, also see outages from an IT perspective, or caused by, let's say, the disability or the unavailability of utilities. That touches upon types of plans, because you could have a pandemic plan, you could also touch upon a crisis management plan, and the basis for that, as the fourth bullet, something we address very frequently, is for organizations to perform a business impact analysis. A business impact analysis is something you would perform, and the result of a business impact analysis would be that you have a very clear view which processes, which people, which buildings, which kind of IT is critical to your organization. So for example, if those components, those assets of your company are impacted, that you would have your most urgent plan ready to mitigate against. Last on this slide, just an example on how to go forward. Contingency planning. Multiple organizations in the Dutch Caribbean region are working with ISO standards, for example 9001 on quality management. Some of the organizations locally are moving forward to, for example, healthcare specific certifications. Look into the Curacao Medical Center, for example, that's now preparing for certification for a hospital, JCI, and ISO 22301 is a business continuity management standard, which will help your organization and also, for example, your stakeholders in assessing the different risks there are from a business continuity and disaster recovery perspective. Very important, especially on Curacao, I would say, because we're really stuck in an ecosystem of stakeholders on the island, but also off island. The first one may be something for Jeroen to address, because especially in times like these with the pandemic, the tax authorities are for sure a stakeholder to take into account.
Yeah, I think that the tax authorities can be one of the hardest stakeholders of a business. Tax authorities have a lot of rights to claim any outstanding debts. Therefore, it can be considered to have a proactive approach in case that business do not have sufficient cash to fulfill their obligation to the tax authorities. For example, it's possible that during this COVID-19 crisis, the tax authorities grant special deferral of payment. That's on request of the taxpayer who have a problem by the coronavirus. So I think that the proactive approach is really good, the best approach to the tax authorities.
Yeah, so for sure, I think the proactive approach counts for the other stakeholders as well. In addition to the investors, or for example, landlords and suppliers, I think on all those categories of stakeholders, there's of course a dialogue in this particular crisis on agreements on financial responsibilities. For example, if there's a possibility to not pay rent with the landlord or make other arrangements, we've seen the financial institutions put in place the moratoria, so for clients to take their debt or mortgages or personal loans into the future. There was actually not even a need for us as clients to take it to them. They saw the need to bring it to their clients given the severity of the crisis. So that's, I would say, the financial aspect is for sure important to be proactive on. With regards to the service providers, is also an additional, I would say, attention point. If you're looking to, for example, IT service providers that are pretty dominant, given the fact that when you're talking about a crisis that has a relationship with this example, the pandemic, or maybe something that causes a business interruption, that you have a really clear understanding what the service providers can mean for you in terms of supporting business continuity or preventing business interruption. Because some of the service providers could very well, if bills are not paid, have a pretty lik op stuk beleid, as we say in Dutch, by disconnecting their clients. So there's also an important note to be proactive in that. The fourth one, and the one before last, is on crisis management. Not really sure how the people in the call within their organizations are dealing with crisis management when it confronts the organization with the different components. But it's really important to upfront have a clear design on how to deal with the crisis, because typically when you want to go into a crisis management mode and there are no agreements on roles, responsibilities, communication lines, escalation lines, or whatever kind of agreements, then it's modus firefighting, as we say, and then it's really difficult to have a comprehensive view if you're taking the right steps in the right time, and if you're informing the right stakeholders, for example, as well. Some points that are addressed here on crisis management: get a chain of command in place. A chain of command does not necessarily have to be, let's say, the hierarchy of your typical organization. Could very well be that you have a crisis manager appointed besides the typical role they have in their organization, but that it's really clear that who is in charge of managing the crisis, and of course also, in addition to managing the crisis, the communication aspect of the crisis, who is in charge of external communications and in what kind of order that takes place. So chain of command and appointment of a crisis team. Essential context list, also really important. It seems a no-brainer, but for example, we've worked with clients in the region that had physical contact lists in a suitcase in buildings of their company. In fact, as part of a crisis management response policy, that, for example, if a crisis would occur, if something would happen, these suitcases would be opened, and then there would be the essential contacts. The difficult thing would be, of course, if you have a fire in one building and the suitcase goes into the fire as well, there's nothing to look into. And the bad thing is, if you have essential contacts there that left the company, let's say 10 or 12 years ago, or even 2 years ago, that list is not going to help anyone within the crisis team. This essential contacts list, as part of business continuity planning, for sure something to have a really clear view on, because again, this is not difficult to do, but a lot of organizations are having difficulties having the discipline to have this updated and tested, typically on a yearly basis. The fourth one, really important, from lessons identified to lessons learned. For the people that are in project management, as an analogy, Prince 2, as the project management methodology, also has a really strong focus on lessons learned. But typically what happens is that lessons learned never are learned, but only identified. And then we have a list of lessons identified, and then we have that list, and that list goes somewhere. And we never actually, in real life, learn from the lesson we learned or identified, so the experience we had. So what's really important in terms of skills and drills, once you notice something that went wrong, go forward and make sure that behavior is different than in the prior crisis. Lastly, alternate resources, something to evaluate when a recession or a pandemic or a crisis is at hand. It might very well be the case that you have the need for certain resources. It might be the case that certain employees are no longer available because, for example, now they have tested positive for COVID-19 and they need to be in quarantine. But what also could be is that you don't have a building available anymore because you've been struck by a hurricane or other kind of damages. So this is also good, in addition to the scenarios to be planned for as part of the business impact assessment we mentioned 2 slides earlier. Really important to think about what would that mean for our needs in terms of alternate resources. Last but not least, on the resilience wheel, strategy and leadership. Really important, and for the people that are in the call, entrepreneurs with a workforce now dealing with COVID-19, our advice would be lead with a lighter touch. As I said in the beginning, people have a really personal way of dealing with crisis or with a recession. It might concern them in terms of uncertainty about their job. They might feel at risk because they might get affected with COVID-19 in this particular case. And what's really important for a leadership team or for a leader in a company to have a good understanding what a recession or a crisis does with their people, and really understanding what they're going through from a emotional perspective, and that will get a really bond, I would say, context of collaboration possibilities that will get the company through the crisis. And what really ties into that is storytelling. What we did in this webinar, in the second slide, when we showed a bit of Neo in the Matrix, is something you can do in your company as well. People are always looking for hope. If you're feeling depressed because the situation you're in with your company, revenues dropped, you're looking for a new business model to revamp your business, people are looking for the dot on the horizon. And what you as an entrepreneur could do is really provide the narrative that there is, at the end of the ride, positive things to look out for. As a company, as an employee of the company, as part of a team, and storytelling really contributes to such a context in which you provide that comfort to your people. Some specific guidance on what we've seen, for example, now. A lot of organizations, they were used to managing people on the floor, in the building. We still have, in a lot of companies, we have the clocks when we go in the company in the morning and come out in the evening. And then we had a recession, in this particular case, the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then people went home. And then leadership went home because we were obliged to work from home. Government guided. And then we saw a shift in how to manage workforce no longer physically with you. Something I would say the continents in Europe, Asia, America have all been through, I would say, a decade or a decade and a half before. But here locally on Curacao, it has been a major shift. So from a strategy and leadership perspective, there is a shift going on from input management or input leadership and managing on the presence of people to really giving people the responsibility for the tasks they are executing and only giving them the comfort that a manager or leader is there to coach them, to guide them, to answer any kind of questions. And that ties into trust and control, because there is a lot of trust needed for an organization going through a crisis. But of course, trust is not everything. So controlling, controls in place, policies, procedures on all sorts of topics within your business are going hand in hand. As they say in Dutch, trust comes by foot and leaves by horse. But really, really balanced, giving trust to your company, but having controls in place will give you, I would say, the modus operandi as a leader you can rely upon, that, and that will guide you through a crisis like this. Lastly, redefinition of strategy and business model. What we've seen, particularly now in the last 5 months, is that some companies have been really excellent in redefining their strategy and business model, looking to the restaurants that thought, where is my public and where are my clients going? And they switched to online selling, to e-commerce. They switched to delivery, and then for some of them, it's not really. That's a bit sad. Switching back when all the controls from the government were relieved, but that's a beautiful example of one particular sector that switched business models right away because there was a need to. You're seeing digital companies that are seeing this particular crisis as a beautiful business opportunities to start selling their services on digital transformation or supporting organizations on remote working concepts. In general, I would say the message here is really be agile on your strategy in times of recession and crisis, and really have the ability and let's say the thinking range to reassess and readdress and maybe even change the paradigms to your business. As a second statement, as sort of a slot to this section, we have the statement, the resilience wheel provides me new focus in areas that I haven't had thought about yet.
Can you see the answers, Roy?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It is still running. I have 14 versus 2.
15 versus 2.
That is correct, yeah.
Still running.
Let's take a few more seconds. Well, or this is social desirable answering, which I don't think it is. But it seems as if 9% of the attendees say that it gives new areas that haven't been top of mind yet. So that's, it doesn't say how many or which ones, but if there's a need to discuss that further or whatever kind of need or questions on the particular topics, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or otherwise afterwards when we end this webinar. What I'll do in brief, because I want to stick to my commitment finishing at 5, show you a little bit of what we're up against when we've been through a crisis or a recession. So let me go to the next slide. Post-crisis leadership. And what's difficult now, and it is interesting, but mostly challenging from this particular crisis we have at our hands, is that, as an example, Jeroen and I were preparing for this webinar, and we discussed the fact that a lot of our relationships on Sint Maarten, they have been impacted heavily by crises, I would say the last years, that we on Curacao haven't seen before in that particular impact. Because hurricane season typically goes by us, or we only catch a tail, a little bit of a wind. And they've said when they are now going through, let's say, the 5th month of the pandemic, when they are really experiencing, let's say, even more severe than us, hundreds of cases and lockdowns with the French part of the island, they said, give us an Irma, let's say an F5 hurricane every other day instead of this pandemic. And that's what is difficult about this particular crisis, and we're going to show the slides, the next 4 slides anyways, is that what we would need to find out as entrepreneurs, as organizations, and I think even as citizens with families and children, is that this crisis isn't going away for another long period. There might be a vaccine in a year, but it's probably not going to solve. It's here to stay, as Dr. 𝗲𝘁𝗿𝗿𝗲𝗃𝗿 said in his daily or weekly meetings. So it's difficult talking about post-crisis in context from COVID-19, because we're actually in the midst of new controls being set in place. We're in, let's say, the escalation level 3. So that's difficult about the pandemic. What I would advise all entrepreneurs in the call on is get a real strong view. If this stays the way it is for the next 6, 9 to 12 months, what your business will be like in that particular period. So in the next half year to a year, because this is not something like a hurricane we can respond to and see the damage of really clearly and tangibly. It is still going on. So that's something we need to deal with. So really a new experience from, I would say, recovery perspective. On post-crisis leadership. 4 slides with 4 joint concepts that will help you as an entrepreneur, as a leader, or I think even as a self-employed professional, to get things back into place after you've been through a recession. So rebuild and reassure. The main concept of rebuild and reassure is when you've been through a crisis, it's important for you to get a new confidence with your employees, with your stakeholders, with your clients, with your, let's say, supply chain upward as well. You've been through a crisis, you adapted, you survived. Probably you survived when you're going through into this phase. But it's important to really establish a new baseline for your company going forward. So rebuild and reassure. So that's different for your customers when you're redefining a customer journey. It is different for your employees that probably also have had mental aspects to the crisis the company has been through. You might have been communicating in a way that impacted your people that you want to communicate with your people on. So a lot of topics you've been through in the crisis, that is something you want to rebuild and reassure. The second one is review and revise. And important here is that once you're going through a recession, once you're going through a business dip, maybe not as severe as the COVID-19 crisis currently, it's important to have just do nothing for a small period and review what the root cause was for the crisis you were in. It's of course very different for COVID-19 pandemic because it's not us as a company and our wrongdoing. We know where it came from, although, or we think we do. But in the realm of crises, of recessions you could go through, it's important to really have a clear view on what were the root causes, what can I learn, what did I do during the crisis, and is there anything I want to adapt so I don't go into the same response as this one. I want to learn, and that's important. So this is also tying into transferring lessons identified into lessons learned. So the third one, reflect and renew. It's also important to really go, I would say, almost 1 or 2 levels deeper. What did we learn as a company from this crisis? So, and what does it mean for our corporate values? What does it mean for our business model going forward? Is this still the good strategy we're on? Is this still the good market we are addressing? Or should we really revamp or rethink paradigms to the business? Sometimes organizations, entrepreneurs, they found a formula, they were successful, and then when things changes in your marketplace, some of them, just an example, look at Nokia, don't have the agility to reflect and renew in a good direction. So that's also really important as an entrepreneur. And lastly, from these 4 twins of R&Rs is restore and reinvigorate. It's really important to look into the impact a crisis had, for example, on your reputation. You've been dealing with clients, you've been dealing with your personnel, you've been dealing, for example, maybe with the tax authorities, maybe with the people from the Ministry of Economic Affairs, if you were financially supported. And it's really important to reinvigorate relationships, reinvigorate with the people in your organization and restore, let's say, a baseline for with your strategy and your business model going forward. This is something a lot of organizations never come to do because they just stick to plan, do, plan, do, plan, do, and never go into check and act of the typical Deming cycle we use in managing companies. But it's really important to address these as well, mainly when you're going through a crisis or a recession that is heavily impacting your organization, as for example, currently the COVID-19 crisis is doing. As a slot to this particular block, short block with more, I would say, high-level takeaways on how to go forward as a company and a leader, we have another statement. And that statement would be more looking into the future. I am prepared for a future economic crisis. So are we? I have 7 and 14. Jeroen, how many do you have?
15.
Yeah.
Maybe this question is a bit too early in time because we are in a crisis. So it's hard to prepare for a future crisis, but 16 false, 7 true.
Yeah. Yeah, and that ties in, and that's a valuable remark because it ties into the characteristics of and the nature of COVID-19 currently. Yeah. Because it's, I think the business impact of this pandemic is something, I think a lot of people, when you look into, for example, the top 10 global risks World Economic Forum is putting forward, there might have been talks on a pandemic. A lot of, I would say, global leaders have been warning on that as well. But on an organizational level, I haven't seen, and we as a company didn't do that neither, haven't seen organizations really prepare for something like this. The big multinationals that are, let's say, publicly traded, with making billions of euros or dollars every year, asking for governmental support after 2 months of a pandemic, it shows that this is a crisis. I think I would say 80–90% of the working people were not prepared for. So let's hope that most of the falses are through that context. Otherwise, I think it's a calling for us as entrepreneurs in the Curacao private and public sector to really join forces to see how we can go forward and support each other in multiple ways possible. Yeah, because that's what we need to do to pull each other through this crisis. Lastly, to wrap up this call, one last look into the Matrix and Neo, because he was actually going through his journey and making it through multiple crises when he was going through the movie Matrix. But he had another journey ahead.
I know you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. I'm going to show them a world without you. A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
Yeah, so with this last clip, I think on behalf of Jeroen, but he can share his personal thank you words as well. We would like to thank you for attending this webinar. Very brief, very short, only of course headlines of experiences we've had ourselves and our clients. but I would say the most important message in the context of, for example, storytelling is that fighting through a crisis typically makes us come out stronger, and it might be a bad or not a saying we are really glad with, but let's look forward with our lookings into the horizon that there are multiple business opportunities on this crisis as well, and we will conquer them and yeah, make up for the losses we are encountering in these months.